Now, as we close out the little group of videos on stored procedures, I want to talk about stored procedure security. Because in our little tour of all the various aspects of stored procedures, the input parameters, the output parameters, the case logic, handling errors, and so forth, you kind of start to get the sense that there's an awful lot of power in stored procedures, but in many ways, the real power of stored procedures is the security and stability they bring to our databases. Now, there's many security advantages that stored procedures offer over just regular T-SQL statements, especially when you stop to think about the structure of our applications. Now, quite often, our database is being manipulated by some sort of exterior program, whatever program is being used to collect data from end users or allow end users to identify the data that needs to be modified or deleted. And usually this is written in C# or C++ or VB.NET or something that is connecting to our database and executing commands. If we can connect to the database and call stored procedures as opposed to building queries out there in our code and passing the queries across the network, we pick up a lot of advantages by using stored procedures. One of the big ones is abstraction. The users can execute complex actions just by calling the stored procedure without actually knowing anything about the underlying tables or objects. All they know is they are going to send some data to the database. The data gets dropped into input parameters. Magic happens. The data shows up in the database. It gets modified. It gets deleted, whatever. And the user actually doesn't even need to know anything about it. And that even includes the programmer who's writing the code. Encryption. The code that's executed by a stored procedure can be encrypted. And notice I have abbreviated as stored procs right here. And you will hear them called stored procs all over the place in the real world. So don't let that throw you here or on the exam. You can also prevent SQL injection. SQL injection is a trick where if I'm asking for a parameter, you can pass a parameter in, but you can also pass a SQL command in with the parameter and do things like drop tables or wreak havoc in my database. But with a stored procedure, anytime you pass a parameter in, I can run an if statement and make sure that there are no like double dashes or colons or anything like that that would indicate to me that you're trying to pass an additional SQL command in. So you can just go out and read about SQL injection on the internet. It's pretty fascinating, but we can prevent this a lot easier using stored procedures. Stored procedures also give us very consistent data modification. The stored procs execute the same code in the same order every time they're called. So it's very predictable. There's also consistent transaction support. We're going to talk about transactions a little later on in the course if you're not familiar with them. But transactional operations are consistently executed and applied. We have execution control. Stored procs can only be executed by users or groups that have been granted the execute permission. So you can either execute it or not. And when you can execute it, you can only execute what has been written in the stored procedure by a T-SQL or a database developer, and that has been checked and approved by the database administrator. So a lot of control there. And then last but not least, error handling. With stored procedures, we can use that try-catch block, and this gives us the ability to utilize consistent, efficient error handling and reporting of errors. We can take those in that catch block. We can write them into an errors table. I've done this in the real world, and it's so cool for a user to call up and say, hey, I got a problem. And just based on the user it is, by the time they tell us what the problem is, we've already looked it up in the error table. And based on the time and the user, we can start to read to them the error message that they got instead of having a user say, an error message popped up and I just said, okay, and it went away. Well, we can look in that error table and see exactly what happened. That's thanks to the error handling capabilities inside stored procedure. So there's a lot of power here. There's a lot of security. There's a lot of advantages to stored procedures. And I would strongly encourage you for the exam, make sure all of this stuff makes sense to you about stored procedures. And for the real world especially, make friends with all things stored procedure in Microsoft SQL Server because there's a lot of power and a lot of safety here.